We live and exist in a predominantly digital world. Most of our interaction, the sharing of knowledge, the kind of transactions that we do, the kind of work that we do is done on a digital platform. This is as compared to many or a few years ago. But the question most of us ask, where did all this come from? How did we find ourselves here? Who are these people that dared to dream and put their lives on the line to make sure that we got here? A few names obviously will pop up. And unknown to many is that for the world to get here, there have been serious battles of the smarties, the intellectuals, the intelligent, the people who dared to use their brains as designed and defined by God. Not so much of these battles have been your typical physical battles, but they have been mental. They have been battles of a business nature, battles of a strategic nature, battles on the skill side of life, battle on this personnel and personality side of life, and of course battles on the wit side of life. And that culminated into a few companies clearly controlling the digital space. The digital space is made of three major components. There is the hardware, then there is the software, and of course there is the advertisement side of it, and that we know the platform is search engines. Yeah. Each of these components play an important role in making sure that we experience the best in our digital interaction. If I may ask you, which one do you think is the most vital? Which presents the biggest market or wealth opportunity? Had you existed in the early 90s, which avenue would you have chosen if you had an ambition of leading the digital space? These are the kind of questions that filled the minds of these gentlemen as they battled it out to lead the world into the next generation of industries. The first person, as you guessed it, is of course Bill Gates. He is right at the center of these digital battles that have been the top stories in the last 3 decades. At the beginning of these battles, he was the CEO of Microsoft in 1998. He was 43 years old, but the richest man in the world. His company, Microsoft, was located in Redmond, Washington, but it ran 95% of the world's personal computers. Can you imagine that? MSN.com was its then search engine that had been launched just a year before, and Bill Gates boasted of how it will become the #1 site on the internet. At the time, there existed other companies that were doing their best to get a piece of this pie. But none of these companies, at Bill Gates' own admission, were a threat. This was because his business acumen and ruthlessness ensured that these companies were afraid of going at Microsoft because it had a history of completely dismantling competition through something called price wars. Microsoft was a bigger organization, it had a bigger global reach, and as such, it could clearly fight on the price wars front that most of these companies could not survive. And most of these companies that were competing against Microsoft were very much aware of its ruthlessness. And just to mention, for your own understanding, there was a company by the name Sun Microsystems. There was a company by the name Oracle, and of course Netscape. Bill Gates did not fear any of this, and he made it very clear that the only possible real threat could be somewhere in a garage in San Francisco, building a completely new product. Bill Gates never believed that there was any company that could give Microsoft a run for its money. And even the companies that I have mentioned were clearly not in his mind whenever he thought about real competition. But with the full understanding of what happens at San Francisco, Bill Gates understood that the kind of brains that existed at the Silicon Valley will definitely or are definitely working on coming up with a new product. And that was his only fear. Later on in this series, you will find out who this person eventually became and why there was someone who almost brought Microsoft to its knees. This, however, does not take away from Bill Gates the fact that he was a fine programmer. His initial works are legendary, and his peers have consistently praised his kind of programming skills at that time. These guys only had limited memory to work with. A kilobyte extra was like water in the desert. It made a whole difference as compared to present-day programmers who have endless resources of storage to work with. This is the beginning of a series of stories on digital wars. Now, for Microsoft to be where it was, it had beaten companies like Apple. Apple was co-founded by Steve Jobs, who was thrown out of it in 1985, but he returned in 1996. Steve Jobs forced out the chief executive in July 1997, at the point where Apple had made a loss of $1 billion for the financial year. So can you imagine there was a time that Apple had made a loss of almost $1 billion? The story of Apple is one of those stories that if ever you lack something to remind you of the real journey of entrepreneurs, you need to read through the story of Apple, the tremendous growth it has done in the last 20 years. Now, the difference between these two people, that is Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, is that Steve Jobs was not a programmer like Bill Gates. He had great talent in personal design and social skills. It is said that Steve Jobs could discern weaknesses and desires of people across a negotiating table to navigate to a deal. He could use his charm to drive subordinates and even equals to produce better products than they ever expected they could. Steve Jobs' lust for design has no obvious roots. But one interesting thing is that he once said, "Some people think design is how it looks, but rather it is how it works." And to be able to design something very well, you have to fully understand what it is all about. Those are the words of Steve Jobs. As a matter of fact, Steve Jobs wouldn't sell anything he didn't completely believe in or use himself. He was not really a salesman, but when he needed something, he would use his negotiating skills to get them. Due to his experience at Apple, there is documented two versions of Steve Jobs. Of course, the first one was before he was kicked out of his company, and the second one is when he made a return to Apple in 1996. The Steve Jobs that was in Apple before spent a lot of time by himself and focusing on very trivial details that nobody else could see. He immersed himself into the world of design. But the second generation Steve Jobs understood one thing, that for a company to succeed, they need to have very good managers, and he himself knew that he had to be a very good manager both of people and the company's principal resources of money. The Steve Jobs that returned already knew the truth that many business people learn later on, that you only get smart after you've gone a bust 3 times. You can only get smarter once you've fallen 3 times. Now, how did he approach his second coming? When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, Apple had made so many useless products that didn't really address the market. So Steve Jobs killed all the surplus products. He said Apple had chased profits instead of market share and became greedy instead of focusing on its customers' desires. He fired many staff and axed many projects that were irrelevant at the time of his coming back. As a matter of fact, he cut 350 products to just 10. An average person or consumer at that particular point in time could not know which were desktops and which products were laptops. They couldn't even know which products were high or low-end products, because Apple had 15 different computers with meaningless names. Eventually though, after cutting all these products, he only had the following categories: the consumer and the business side, and the portable and the desktop computers. This second coming was going to be tough because Microsoft had already taken over with cheaper personal computers running on Windows, which offered a broader range of software, and that has remained the case even up to now. To picture how far down Apple had fallen, think of Michael Dell, the chief executive of Dell Computer in '97, said that if he was Steve Jobs, he would shut down Apple and give the money to shareholders. At the time, Dell company was 5 times bigger than Apple. This statement alone made Steve Jobs angry, and Steve Jobs swore to make Dell Computer his minor obsession. Other than this, Steve Jobs went ahead and focused on the dysfunctional supply chain that had engulfed the Apple company. He had to look for people who fully understood how important supply chain frameworks are to the hardware business. And that is how he went and looked for someone by the name Tim Cook in 1998 and Sabi Khan, who was sent to China to oversee manufacturing. So for those people who don't know, Apple products are manufactured in China. And that is where the supply chain of Apple is completely optimized. And over time, Tim Cook and Steve Jobs just clicked. And they managed to whip Apple supply chain into line by closing up factories and warehouses that were manufacturing all these different types of products. Now, most of us don't really know how far we have come to get here, where we are consuming all this manner of products, both the software, the hardware, and of course the search engines. But I'm setting up a journey of describing to you how far these industries have come and the stories behind the great men who have done this. And I'm hoping that you shall be here with us until we arrive to the end of this story. So please just subscribe and click the notification button, because I will want you to know as soon as I have uploaded the next episode of this series, so that you don't miss out on anything.